So while the world was watching missiles fly across the Middle East this week, something else was happening that barely made the headlights.
Mark Carney spent 10 days moving through India, Australia, and Japan, stitching together trade deals, defense agreements, and investment partnerships that could reshape Canada's position in the global economy.
And the contrast, it couldn't be sharper. One leader is launching strikes, and the other is launching trade routes.
So today, we're breaking down what actually happened on this trip, why these countries matter, and whether Canada is quietly building a new economic alliance while the old world order falls apart.
Because the global system that we grew up with, the one dominated by Washington, is cracking. And Carney is betting Canada survives that shift by building a network of allies strong enough to stand without it.
So let's start in India, because this part of the trip was the most controversial and the most important. For years, Canada's relationship with India has been frozen. The tensions exploded after allegations that Indian agents were linked to the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia.
Diplomatic relations completely collapsed. Trade talks stalled, trust disappeared, but India is now the world's most populous country and one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. Ignoring it isn't a strategy.
So Carney went to Mumbai and New Delhi in a very clear goal: reset the relationship without pretending the past didn't happen. And the results, they were significant.
They were. Canada and India signed deals worth roughly $5 billion, covering everything from uranium exports to pharmaceuticals and consumer products. The biggest headline of the trip was a multi-year agreement to sell Saskatchewan uranium to India, a deal worth about $2.6 billion.
Listen, India needs massive amounts of energy to power its growing economy, and Canada happens to sit on some of the largest uranium reserves in the world. But the bigger prize is what both countries promised to pursue next: a full comprehensive trade agreement before the end of the year. If that happens, it would open a market of more than 1.4 billion people to Canadian exports.
Now, here's where things do get a little complicated. Because while Carney was in India negotiating these deals, the Middle East exploded into war. Missiles, drones, strikes on military bases, the entire region suddenly on edge.
And Carney was halfway across the world trying to balance diplomacy, trade negotiations, and a rapidly escalating global crisis. But instead of flying home, he kept his eye on the ball and kept moving. His next stop was Australia.
And this is where the trip started to reveal the bigger strategy. When Carney addresses the Australian Parliament in Canberra, he said something that tells you exactly how he sees the future. He said the global order built after World War II is breaking down.
And countries like Canada and Australia, what he calls middle powers, we all know that now, have a choice. Either sit back and let the largest countries dictate the rules, or start writing the rules together, united.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Canada and Australia agreed to do. The two countries signed agreements on critical minerals, defense cooperation, artificial intelligence, and wildfire response.
And speaking of that, our friend Anthony is a waterbombing pilot, and he has fought fires in Australia and in the USA, and of course in Canada. We are already interlinked in that department.
Yep.
Now, those minerals matter more than most people realize. Lithium, uranium, rare earth elements, these are materials that power fighter jets, electric vehicles, satellites, and advanced electronics.
And between them, Canada and Australia control a huge portion of the world's supply, which means that if they coordinate their policies, they suddenly become incredibly powerful players on the global stage.
There was also a major investment announcement while he was in Australia. An Australian pension grant, the IMF investors, they pledged up to $10 billion in infrastructure investment in Canada over the next decade.
Whoa. That means like airport transportation networks, major infrastructure projects, that kind of capital. Think about it. It matters when your largest trading partner is suddenly threatening tariffs and economic pressure at every turn.
And Carney framed the relationship in a way that actually caught a lot of attention in Australia. He called Canada and Australia strategic cousins.
Ooh, I like that one.
We agree.
I agree, definitely. Two countries on the opposite sides of the planet with remarkably similar systems of law, government, and natural resources. Two democracies that can actually trust each other. And that word trust, it keeps coming up in Carney's speeches. Have you noticed that?
It has. That's because trust has become one of the most valuable commodities in international politics. When the rules stop working, like it has in the United States, countries start relying on relationships.
And that takes us to the final stop on the trip, Japan. This meeting may end up being the most important on the entire tour.
And it imports almost all of its energy and natural resources, which means Canada is suddenly looking very attractive.
Carney met with Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, who just won a massive landslide election in Japan. And together, they signed what both governments are calling a comprehensive strategic partnership.
The agreement expands cooperation on defense, energy, critical minerals, AI, and technology. The usual stuff.
Yeah, what he's been doing all the way across Asia. So Canada and Japan, what they're also doing is they're planning more joint military exercises in the Pacific. And Japan is even considering participating in Operation Nanook, Canada's major Arctic sovereignty exercise.
Which is fascinating if you think about it, because it means an Asian power is training alongside Canada in the Arctic. That's how much the global security map is shifting.
And there's also a major economic angle to this as well. Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, and others now produce about 77% of the light vehicles manufactured here in Canada. That's a huge jump from about 44% just a decade ago.
So Japan has suddenly become one of the most important investors in Canada's auto industry.
Carney spent part of the trip meeting with Japanese business leaders, trying to convince them to expand those investments. But the energy side may matter even more.
Yeah, Japan imports roughly 87% of its energy. And what does Canada have? Energy. We are sitting on a massive LNG capacity on the West Coast. One Japanese company, Mitsubishi, well, it already owns a major stake in the LNG Canada project in British Columbia.
And if additional export terminals come online, Canada could become one of Japan's most important energy suppliers.
So, when we take a step back and look at the pattern, India, Australia, Japan, they are three major Indo-Pacific economies, three major democracies, three major trading partners that are increasingly nervous about global stability.
And Canada just spent 10 days strengthening ties with every single one of them.
Meanwhile, Washington spent the week launching missiles and escalating another regional war.
Now, to be fair, Carney's trip wasn't perfect. His position on the Middle East conflict has shifted several times. At first, he appeared to support the strikes in Iran. Then, he acknowledged the initial attacks violated international law. Then, he said Canada would not rule out participation if allies were threatened.
Now, that kind of messaging can be confusing, and it creates a lot of questions back here at home. But even critics acknowledge something very important. Carney is showing up, and more importantly, he's listening.
I mean, may sound basic, but it's surprisingly rare in politics right now. A lot of leaders make a decision, plant their flag, and then refuse to move no matter what happens.
But Carney's approach has been different. You can see him weighing options in real time. He's listening to allies, listening to Canadians. He's adjusting when the situation changes, and that is exactly what leadership is supposed to look like in a crisis in a democracy.
Let's look at the Middle East conflict this week. People heard one sentence that Canada wouldn't categorically rule out participation, and suddenly the internet blew up and decided that we were joining Trump's war.
But that's not what he said at all. What he said was Canada would stand by allies if they were threatened. That's a very different position than blindly following Washington into a war.
Yeah, supporting allies who are attacked is what defense alliances are built on. Signing up to fight someone else's war because the US or Israel demands it, that's something entirely different.
And Canadians have been very clear about the distinction. People in this country do not want Canada dragged into a war started by Trump or Netanyahu. But they do expect Canada to protect its citizens and stand with democratic allies if those allies are attacked.
And that's the balance Carney's been trying to strike this whole time. And you can actually see him adjusting his language as the public reaction comes in.
And it is once again what a responsive democracy looks like. Leaders are supposed to listen to the will of the people, not ignore them.
Listen, the fact that Canadians are debating this openly, arguing about it, questioning it, demanding clarity, is actually a sign that the system is working. Because in a real democracy, foreign policy isn't decided by ego or the whim of some madman. It's shaped by public accountability.
And right now, Canadians are making it very clear where we stand.
So instead of following Trump and Netanyahu into yet another illegal war, our Prime Minister is meeting leaders, signing agreements, and building partnerships. That matters when the international system is really starting to fracture. The US is taking whatever it wants, no matter what the cost.
Meanwhile, China is expanding its economic influence, and conflicts are spreading across multiple regions, which means country like Canada, we need options.
And that's literally what this trip was about, options. If Washington becomes even more unpredictable, well then Canada needs other markets, other investment partners, other security relationships. And that's exactly what we just watched unfold over the past 10 days.
Canada repairing relationships with India and opening the door to one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. We're deepening investment with Australia, a country that controls massive reserves of the same critical minerals the modern economy runs on.
And we're strengthening a strategic partnership with Japan, one of the largest economies and most technologically advanced democracies in the world. Now, none of those moves grab the same attention as missiles and airstrikes, but they're how countries build resilience.
Because the world is clearly entering a new phase. The old system, the one where the United States guaranteed stability and everyone else organized their economies around it, well, that is no longer reliable.
No. Building relationships, expanding trade, strengthening security partnerships, all that stuff is exactly what this whole trip was about.
It's not about picking sides in a global rivalry, but building enough connections that Canada isn't forced to depend on any single country.
Now, we'll see if it works, but one thing is certain. The world that Canada grew up in, that we grew up in, isn't the world we're living in anymore. And the countries that adapt fastest will be the ones still standing when the dust all settles.
So thanks for watching, everyone, and leave your thoughts in the comments below.
Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our Substack and Facebook group. And hey, if you want to support this channel and keep it independent, check out the AT.
And if you want to see some travels from Asia, check out the Planet D Travel. We have that in the link below, and you can see just how far ahead Japan and China are.
In the meantime, keep talking, keep listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.
Bye-bye.